Welcome back to World Religions, a video series to accompany a semester-long survey of world religions class, specifically to accompany the textbook A Short Introduction of World Religions, edited by Christopher Partridge. In this video, we're going to be looking at Korean and Japanese religions, which correspond to chapters 23 and 24 of the textbook. Chapter 23, Sin-kyo, Korea's traditional religion. Sin-kyo is one of the names for Korea's indigenous religion. This is a type of animism or shamanism. It's also known as Sin-do and Musok, or Muism in English, which refers specifically to Korean shamanism. So this is an animistic religion in which many gods and spirits are in nature, controlling natural forces. They inhabit heaven, the soil, mountaintops, water, trees, etc. In the picture is a mudang, or female shaman. In terms of religion generally in Korea, according to a 2021 Gallup poll, the largest group is no religion, making up 60% of the population, at least in South Korea. The largest religion is actually Christianity. Protestant Christians make up 17% of the population of South Korea, while Catholic Christians make up 6%, for a total of around 23%. The next largest religion is Buddhism. All of the Buddhist sects together make up 16% of the population, and then the rest other 1%. And that would include a variety of particular sects, including new religions. In a separate 2012 survey, only 15% of Koreans identified as atheist. And you might think there's a discrepancy between that and the 2021 Gallup poll, in which 60% identify as no religion. But while there certainly has been an increase in the last decade of people who are no religion or not affiliated with any religion, not all of those people would self-identify as atheist. So that explains some of the difference between those two figures. In terms of culture, Confucianism, which came to Korea from China, is also very influential. So even though Sin-kyo is just a tiny percentage of the population in terms of people who practice it, it's been very influential in Korean culture, and arguably it probably still has some residual effect on how Koreans interpret or practice both Buddhism and Christianity. And there have been sects formed in the last century or two, new religions, that combine ideas from Sin-kyo or shamanism with Christianity, for example. In this slide, we have a timeline of some of these significant events in Korean history, particularly those relating to religion. So according to tradition, Tangun, who was a godlike figure, founded Korea, the ancient kingdom of which was called Go-joseon, in 2033 BC. This is not a historically accurate number, but it is found in a traditional Korean chronicle. In 194 BC, a man named Wei Man, who was from China, took over the kingdom of Go-joseon, and it was later conquered by the Han Dynasty, also of China. So this began a long period of Chinese influence on Korea. It's when Confucianism and Taoism and later Buddhism was brought to the Korean peninsula. From 18 BC to 660 AD, Korea was in the Three Kingdoms period, where the peninsula was divided among three main kingdoms, Baekje, Goguryeo, and Silla. In the 4th century AD, during the Three Kingdoms period, Buddhism was brought to Korea by monks from China and one from India, but via China. From 1158 to 1210 AD, Chinul founded the Chogyé order of Seon Buddhism. Seon is the Korean version of Chan, or Zen Buddhism, and that's just an example of how a lot of the Korean Buddhist sects were modeled on those in China. So they fall under the Chinese Mahayana Buddhist family of religions, you could say. And from 1392 to 1897 was the Joseon period. So this was a dynasty that suppressed Buddhism. Buddhism was still practiced, but it was not supported so much by the government, and it was somewhat curtailed. Instead, they supported Neo-Confucianism, which was a revival of Confucianism that originated in China during the Song dynasty. But Korean Neo-Confucian philosophers also made important contributions to the philosophy of Neo-Confucianism, and Confucianism is still a living tradition, at least in South Korea. So one of the legendary beings of Sinkyo is heaven, or Hwanin. Heaven brings sunlight and rain. He also sends lightning, drought, and disasters as judgments upon wicked people. And there's kind of like a belief that humans are able to live, including breathe, because of Hwanin or Hananin. The kings of Korea would confess their sins and appeal to heaven if there were a natural disaster. So, in other words, the Korean kings traditionally played a role in Sinkyo. And heaven was the grandfather of Tangun, the legendary founder of Korea. So he still remains an important figure, both in Korean shamanism or Sinkyo, and in some of the new religion sects that were founded under the influence of Sinkyo. Hwanung, or Ung, whose name means supreme divine regent, was the son of heaven, or Hwanin. And unlike his father, he wanted to live on the earth. He had a dream of descending to the earth to live among the mountains and valleys. So he got permission from his father to descend to the earth with 3,000 of his followers, which included spirits of clouds and rain. And he landed on a mountain called Bakdu in northern Korea, specifically on a sandalwood tree. And there was a cave nearby where he met a tiger and a bear who worshipped him, and then they wanted to become human. So he told the tiger and the bear that they could become human if they only ate herbs, specifically garlic and mugwort, the latter of which is sometimes used in traditional Korean medicine, for 100 days. The tiger couldn't cut it. He quit after 20 days, but the bear kept fasting. And so the bear was turned into a woman by Hwanung, and she was named Ung-yo. Now, Ung-yo could find no one to marry her, but she wanted to marry and have children. So Hwanung changed himself into a bear, married the bear woman, and they fathered a child, Tangun. So Tangun is sort of half bear, half human, and according to tradition, he founded the kingdom of Go-Joseon, the first kingdom in Korea. Thus, he was the founder of Korea. There is a festival called Keijonjol, Opening of Heaven Day, which celebrates the nation, but celebrating the act of Tangun in creating that ancient kingdom. And Go Joseon, it has the same name as Joseon or Chosun, but it adds Go before it to indicate it was the ancient version of that kingdom. So there's a lot of ideas in Korean religion, Sinkyo included, that show Chinese influence, including yin and yang. So yin and yang was brought over with Taoism and Confucianism and just Chinese culture generally during the period of the Han Dynasty influence on Korea. And yin is the force of nature, you could say, the natural force that's regarded as dark, as negative, as passive, as weak, as destructive. It's associated with the female, with the mother, also with moisture. Yang is the opposite of all those. And they're regarded as opposing forces, but in a kind of dynamic harmony that emerges out of their interactions, but it's always changing. And this dynamic harmony of yin and yang is symbolized by the taeguk symbol in Korean culture. It's also on the South Korean flag. So geomancy is a system of divination based on yin and yang and also on the theory of 5 elements: wood, metal, fire, water, and earth, which was also brought over from China to Korea. So it's similar to Chinese feng shui, and it's used to site houses and graves. The later Neo-Confucians, this was from basically the medieval period onward, they also borrowed from yin-yang theory. They were trying to figure out the role of heavenly principle in human nature. How important is the knowledge of right and wrong that's innate in us, given to us by heaven, which is a general Confucian belief. Well, the Korean Neo-Confucians, many of them concluded, yes, the heavenly principle is quite important. It's predominant in a sense, but we also are given our own individual allocation of energy or ki. This is the Korean way of saying the Chinese concept of qi. So this is a type of mental slash physical energy that we have in us, and it doesn't always accord perfectly with heavenly principle. So each individual has their own apportionment of yin and yang energy, and that's what causes them to sometimes depart from the moral principle that they still have innately within themselves. So these Neo-Confucians interpreted Confucian moral self-cultivation in terms of training your ki so that it matches or follows along with the heavenly principle that you also have inside you. There are many rituals in Sinkyo. The word gut means a ritual or shamanic ceremony. These are some of the examples given by the textbook. During the spring, there's a plowing ritual where farmers use music and ritual to pacify spirits of the earth. There's also a traditional ridgepole ceremony when you're building a new house. When the central ridgepole is raised, wine and food are thrown at it, and a member of the household chants, "Please, grandfather and grandmother of the ridgepole, bless us with good luck and long life and many sons." When going on a long journey, there's a ceremony of throwing a stone on an altar, which is supposed to prevent sore feet on a long journey. And there's also a custom of spitting on an altar as a sign of purification and warding off evil spirits. And then there are burial rituals as well, as you would expect. The belief is that spirits of the earth must be satisfied before a body can be buried. So this gives you a little bit of a feel, the flavor of Sinkyo and Korean shamanism, the way they're still practiced. Again, this would be a tiny percentage of the population that still performs these, but it still has a kind of strong cultural influence, you could say, over South Korean culture as a whole. So I mentioned this term mudong. This is the Korean term for a shaman. Traditionally, they were mostly female. Like other shamans, they cure disease. They conduct communal sacrifices that for farmers would assure a good harvest, and for fishermen would assure both a safe journey and a good catch. And they're also believed to be able to make barren women fertile. They can recall spirits of the dead after funerals and lead them to the afterlife. And they can also pacify the spirits of those who died violent or tragic deaths so they won't bother or trouble their family members. There are also male shamans as well. They're called paksuk, although they are less common. And this is a picture of a famous modern mudong performing a ceremony. And you can see in the background are a bunch of offerings being left on an altar to some gods. Ancestor worship is another part of Sinkyo. Death is believed to be impure, to destroy the cosmic harmony, and so there are a bunch of rituals associated with it. Now, around 2,000 years ago, so in ancient Korea, they would bury their dead with personal belongings, including gold and silver. From around the 3rd century AD and after, this was during the period of Chinese influence, Confucianism came over, and Confucian methods or styles of ancestor worship became adopted into Korean religion. And in Confucianism, Confucian ethics regards filial piety or being a good son or daughter, respecting, honoring, even worshiping your parents and ancestors as the highest virtue, as the source of all morality. So the Confucian style of ancestor worship is still practiced now in Korea, which is to offer food to family members at their death and at certain times of the year when they are memorialized, in the hope that the ancestor would bring good fortune to their descendants. And the picture in the slide is of modern ancestor veneration and altars set up for a festival. So I mentioned some of the Chinese religions that influenced Korean religion. Historically, Sinkyo was combined by most Koreans with several different Chinese traditions, mainly Confucianism and Buddhism. So Confucianism, as already mentioned, influenced Korean ancestor worship. Taoism was less prominent, but it still influenced things like Korean magic, the aforementioned geomancy, and just shamanistic rituals and metaphysical concepts generally. So like Taoist cosmology basically got incorporated into Sinkyo. And Buddhism became associated with healing suffering and also with divination. And then there was the Neo-Confucianism too. So just like Chinese religion historically was sort of a mix of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, in Korea, the religion was a mix of Sinkyo, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And Neo-Confucianism was developed by Korean philosophers or scholars, as well as those in China. So the Korean scholars, they didn't only copy what the Chinese Neo-Confucians had to say. They were influenced by them, like Chu Shi, Wang Yangming, but they added their own theories as well. And Confucianism is even more of a living tradition in South Korea than it is in China, you could argue. And here's a picture on the slide of a Confucian ceremony called Chugye Daeje in Korean. So there are also new religions in Korea that, were founded in the last century or two, and a lot of these show an influence from Sinkyo. An example of that is Cheondogyo, which means religion of the heavenly way. So Cheon is sky or heaven, Do is way, and Gyo means religion. So it was founded in the mid 18th century as a response to Christianity. So it seems to incorporate some Christian ideas, like a quasi-Christian concept of heaven as a kind of sovereign deity. But it also incorporates elements from Musok or shamanism. So in Cheondogyo, Cheon or heaven is regarded as the unity, the oneness of the universe. So it's sometimes interpreted as having a pantheistic theology, so that everything is God. Although I think there's a little bit of wiggle room there. Not sure that's believed in by all Cheondogyo followers. But the religion also emphasizes the equality of all people. And so when it arose, it was definitely a reaction against, for example, the Confucian idea of a social hierarchy where some people have more authority over others based on whether they're nobles or rulers, based on whether they are men versus women, based on whether they are teachers versus students, etc. Whereas Cheondogyo was at least somewhat anti-Confucian, emphasizing the equality of people. A more modern example is the Unification Church, nicknamed the Moonies after their founder, Sun Myung Moon. So they are a branch or breaking off from Christianity, but they have a very atypical theology, you might say. The founder, Sun Myung Moon, regards himself as the second coming of Jesus Christ, and he calls himself the true father, and his wife, Hakcha Han Moon, as the true mother. And he taught that he and his wife were without sin, and they would create a new human lineage free from sin. And the picture is just the headquarters of the Cheondogyo sect in Seoul. We're now moving on to chapter 24, Japanese religions. We're going to start with a brief historical introduction and just introduction to the role of religion in Japanese society. Then talk about Shinto, which is Japan's indigenous religion, kind of like their equivalent or parallel to Sinkyo. And then we'll briefly talk about Japanese Buddhism before moving on to religion today in Japan. Part 1, Introduction. Traditional Japanese religion was a combination of Shinto and Buddhism, with Confucianism also being very culturally influential. Nowadays, most Japanese do not regard themselves as religious, and what they mean by that is they're not members of an organized religious sect or shugyo. However, most Japanese people do participate in Shinto and Buddhist festivals, pray at shrines, Shinto shrines, and perform Buddhist ceremonies honoring their ancestors. And this is so even if they don't consider themselves religious. So religion is not usually thought of in Japan as just having a belief or a practice, but rather being affiliated officially with one of those sects. The practice of combining Shinto and Buddhism is sometimes called Shinbutsu Shugo, or God Buddha religion, literally. Shin means God, spirit, Butsu means Buddha, and Shugo means religion. So specifically, this term is often used to describe the combination of images of Shinto gods and Buddhas on the same altar or in the same temple, for example. In the picture is Daibutsu, the great Buddha sculpture in Kotoku-in Temple in Kamakura. And this is a depiction of Amida Butsu, or the Buddha of the Pure Land, the Mahayana Buddhist being who creates a pure land where believers can be reborn if they pray to him. That's one of the main sects of Japanese Buddhism, or Jodo Shu, Pure Land Buddhism. So this is some data on religious affiliation in Japan today. According to the CIA fact book, 70.5% of Japanese are Shinto, 67.2% are Buddhist, and only 1.5% are Christian, and then there's 5.9% other religions. This is somewhat misleading, though, because the Shinto numbers are counting everyone who probably identified as participating in a Shinto festival or praying at a Shinto shrine. These are not people, though, who are actually members of a Shinto sect, which make up just a tiny percentage of the population. Similarly, with Buddhism, that figure is probably inflated and includes not only people who are registered with the local Buddhist temple, but also who've had, probably like contact with Buddhist rituals, like through ancestor worship and the like, or participation in Buddhist festivals. And the fact that a lot of Japanese do both Shinto and Buddhist practices is why those percentages can be higher than 100%. Those religions were traditionally combined in Japan and still are. You look at the NHK survey, this is a Japanese organization from 2012, and the numbers are very different, and it's probably just because they're defining their terms differently. So they're using the normal Japanese conception of belonging to a shugyo, or a sect, as what qualifies you as being religious. So no religion is the largest category at 62%. Buddhism comes in second at 31%. This would probably include just families that are registered with the Buddhist temple, and not all of those are going to be especially devout, probably, or very active. And then Shinto is 3%, Christianity 1%, and then everything else just 1% as well. So about the Shinto score, this is reflecting the fact that there are organized sects of Shinto, but they represent a pretty tiny fraction of the whole religion. Most of the Shinto religion is just focused on praying to kami, or gods, at shrines. And as mentioned before, a lot of Japanese people do that even if they don't identify as religious or belong to a sect. So a bit about the geography of the main islands of Japan. The largest island is Honshu. That's where the modern capital, Tokyo is, and the ancient capitals, Kyoto and Nara, were. Shikoku and Kyushu are two islands to the south, and Hokkaido is an island to the north, which was the last part of Japan to be incorporated into the kingdom and occupied by ethnic Japanese, or Yamato people. If you look to the west, there's a very short distance from the Japanese islands to the Korean peninsula. So a lot of influences and cultural contacts were established with Korea going back to antiquity. For example, Buddhism came to Japan from Korea. And also from Korea, Japan got other influences that were ultimately from China, like Confucianism and Taoism. And there were also contacts between Japan and China directly as well. In terms of ancient Japan, the oldest period is called the Jomon period, and this is when the people inhabiting the Japanese islands were hunter-gatherers, and they may have practiced some early farming as well. They were mostly sedentary. They lived in one place. They had very distinctive pottery that was marked with cords that created these patterns on them. And they appear to have been pretty prosperous and stable, even though they were hunter-gatherers. Eventually, though, there was a wave of migrants, probably from the Korean Peninsula. There were migrants from the south as well, like from Taiwan, for example, into Japan. A few waves of migration, but these later migrants brought rice cultivation and a new language. Even though Japanese is not very closely related to any other living language, it's most closely related to one of the ancient languages of the Korean Peninsula. So that's probably where the migrants came from. And they were a genetically distinct population that partially mixed with, but mostly replaced the preceding Jomon people. The Jomon people may have been related to the Ainu, Ainu, who live in the northern island of Hokkaido, although there aren't that many of them left, and many of them are also of mixed Yamato or Japanese ancestry. So the Yayoi period was from around 300 BC to 300 AD, but a lot of the later elements of Japanese culture were put in place during that period. So the Yamato period is named after the Yamato kingdom. So Japan at this time was divided into numerous feuding kingdoms. Eventually, the Yamato kings, who were based in southern Honshu, dominated the others, and they gradually started to take over all the islands. And their kings became the emperors of Japan, which the dynasty of emperors that goes all the way back to the Yamato is still present in an unbroken succession in Japan. Honshu, the main island, has a lot of Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples in the south. Southern Honshu was where a lot of the traditional capitals were, like Nara and Kyoto. So some of the most famous shrines are those associated with the emperor and the imperial family, the Ise Grand Shrines. They honor the sun goddess Amaterasu, who's regarded as an ancestor of the emperors of Japan. And this is a big part of the reason why emperors are also regarded as kami, or divine beings worthy of worship. For example, when a new prime minister is formed in Japan, they actually report on the formation of their cabinet to the emperor at the Ise Grand Shrines. So there's still a kind of vestigial ritual role for Shinto in the government of Japan. Another famous shrine in Honshu is the Izumo Shrine, dedicated to Okuninushi, the chief kami of the earth spirits, but also regarded as the patron kami of marriage. So people wanting to find a partner or wanting to have a good marriage will go there to pray. Nara and Kyoto are the former capitals. The emperor still lives in Kyoto, and so Kyoto is still like the religious, the artistic, to a certain extent, the intellectual center of Japan, has been since ancient times, and it has many important Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples. Kamakura is another city, which is east of Kyoto, closer to Tokyo, the modern capital, and it also has some important Buddhist temples, some of which are the heads of their sect, such as Chionin, the head of the Jodo Shu, or Pure Land sect of Buddhism. Honshu also has a famous pilgrimage route of 33 Buddhist sites in the west, and this pilgrimage route honors the Bodhisattva Kannon, which is the Japanese name of Guanyin, or Avalokiteshvara, the Mahayana Bodhisattva of compassion. Shikoku, one of the southern islands, has a famous Buddhist pilgrimage route with 88 temples, and many tourists also visit the temples. In the picture on the slide is modern Buddhist pilgrims following that route in Shikoku. Kyushu, another island to the south, contains some of the oldest historical sites in Japan because of its closeness to the Korean peninsula. So Korean merchants used to come over, for example, in antiquity to Kyushu. Much later, in the 16th century, it was the main base for Catholic missions to Japan. There were some Catholic priests who were with Portuguese merchants, and they wanted to convert Japan to Catholicism. First, some of the shogun or military rulers supported Catholicism as a kind of ally against some of the Buddhist sects that were causing them trouble. But later, Catholicism was regarded as a threat to Japanese culture and sovereignty, and so it was violently suppressed. And part of that as well was because there were some rebellious or separatist daimyo. These were feudal lords who were under the shogun or chief military ruler of Japan at the time. and some of them had converted to Christianity. So the shogun at the time killed many of them. Some of the Japanese martyrs were crucified, as you can see in the picture. And those martyrs, some of them were from Japan, others were from Mexico or Europe. So Christianity was mostly wiped out, although there were some Japanese Catholics who basically practiced in secret. They didn't have priests, so they couldn't do the Eucharist, for instance, but they would have little statuettes of the Virgin Mary that they would kind of disguise as statuettes of Kannon, the Buddhist bodhisattva. In any event, later still in Kyushu, there was some samurai who didn't like a later shogun. This was during the Tokugawa era, or the Edo period, when the capital had moved east to Edo, the modern city of Tokyo. So these samurai were unhappy with the shogun because they wanted to modernize the society, make it more developed economically and militarily and scientifically. And so they also, though, were avid supporters of the Shinto religion, and they wanted to establish worship of the emperor as a kami or god as central to Japanese government. So these samurai rebelled. They were successful in fighting against and overthrowing the bakufu, or the military government of the shogun, and they actually established a modern parliamentary system of government, basically modeled on those of Europe, but with a very important place for the emperor of Japan, who was Meiji at the time, both as the official head of state, but also as one of the main kami or gods worshipped in Shinto by all Japanese. Mountains are very important in Shinto and Japanese religion generally. Many of those mountains have Shinto shrines at their summits. Famous example of a sacred mountain is Mount Fuji. And actually Mount Fuji has a whole network of shrines that are around it, and they're dedicated to worshiping the mountain. So the mountain itself can be regarded as a kami, or as a god. And mountains in general are often associated with spiritual powers. Following the Shinto custom, many Buddhist temples are also built on mountains in Japan. An example is Mount Koya, which is the chief temple of the Shingon sect of Japanese Buddhism. In the picture is a sacred gate, or torii, which marks the sacred boundary around a Shinto shrine, as well as a picture of Mount Fuji behind the torii. Shugendo is a whole other religion. It basically combines teachings of Buddhism and Shinto. It also has Taoist principles and other influences, but it's often practiced in the mountains, which is why we're bringing it up now. It has a variety of ascetic exercises that are aimed at enlightenment, magical powers that you could describe as shamanic, spiritualist healing, firewalking rituals, and it represents just a tiny percentage of Japanese people, but it influenced many later religions as well. Part 2, Shinto. In this section, we're going to go into a bit more detail about Shinto beliefs and practices. Shinto, as mentioned, is the indigenous religious tradition of Japan. Even though historically it was combined with Buddhism a lot, you can define the difference pretty clearly. Shinto is the religion that focuses on worshiping kami, which you could translate as god or spirit, at jinja or shrines. And Shinto shrines, jinja, tend to be distinct from Buddhist temples. Among other things, the Buddhist clergy, the monks, they are separate from Shinto priests who perform the rituals at the jinja. So you could describe Shinto as a form of animism insofar as it worships many different gods and spirits in mountains, trees, animals, and other parts of nature as well. So a picture on the slide is of Prince Yamato no Takero. He was an early prince of the Yamato kingdom, the aforementioned, and it's an illustration of the intersection between Shinto and the emperors and history. He wields a sword called kusanagi, which was believed to have been given to the emperors of Japan by the gods. Originally, it comes from heaven, basically. And that illustrates the idea that the emperors of Japan are connected to the gods, and they are regarded as kami, or sacred beings, in their own right as well. Shinto does not have sacred scriptures like a Bible or a Quran. It's mostly a ceremonial religion, and it does have official teachings, you could say, or a right way of doing things, but it's mostly focused on practice, like the correct way of performing a ritual, for instance. So it's often described as an orthopraxy, or correct practice, rather than an orthodoxy, correct doctrine. Nevertheless, it does have two ancient texts that contain important Shinto myths, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, or the Nihongi. And these are actually the two oldest works of Japanese literature generally, and they were written in Chinese characters, which was the first writing system to be used in Japan. So one example of a Shinto myth is the creation myth, and we get different versions of it in the Kojiki and the Nihongi. So one of the terms mentioned in these stories is Takamagahara, which is this high heaven where a lot of the gods live and come from. Now, the first gods were not actually the most famous gods that are worshipped in Shinto. The gods had multiple generations. The first generation was called the Koto Amatsukami, the three distinguishing heavenly gods. The later generations, all seven of them, are referred to as the Kamiyo Nanayo. And some of these Kamiyo Nanayo were Izanagi and Izanami. And these gods are the ones that have a more prominent role in the religion. They're actually worshipped. They are regarded basically as a heavenly mother and father that created humans and also created the islands of Japan. The way they created the islands of Japan was, back then there was a sort of primordial ocean that had salt water in it but didn't have dry land. So Izanagi, he took his jeweled spear, which you can see in the picture on the slide, dipped it into the waters, churned them up, and then drew out the bits of salt from the sea and eventually accumulated them up to make the first island, the first dry land. There's a lot of other stories told about the Shinto kami, as you can imagine. We'll just go through a couple of famous ones here. So Izanagi and Izanami decided to marry and have children. But in order to uh, prepare for this, they decided to do a ceremony. And Shinto ceremonies often involve a dance. In this particular ceremony, they were actually walking, or sort of ritualistically walking, you might say, dancing in a circle, but they started from opposite ends, and then they were going to meet each other. They're going in opposite directions, rather, and when they were going to meet each other, one was supposed to greet the other, and then they would kiss and perform the marital act and have children. But the first time they did this, Izanami spoke first, and Izanagi criticized her, saying the man should speak first. So he regarded it as a mistake in the ritual. But they ended up procreating anyway, and sure enough, the first being that Izanami gave birth to was Hiruko, or the leech baby. So it was malformed, it was kind of no bones, sort of like a leech. And so they basically cast it into the sea, where later on it became Ebisu, who's the god of fish and fishermen and the sea. So they decided to do the ceremony again, but this time Izanagi would speak first. And after that, Izanami gave birth to many, many beings, many kami, many islands. And so they're basically creating and populating the world. However, the last being that Izanami gave birth to was the fire god, Kagutsuchi, who burned her very badly when she was giving birth to him. And eventually she died from her injury. And Izanagi was so distraught and angry, he killed his own son, Kagutsuchi, with his sword. So Izanagi was mourning the death of his wife, Izanami, and he decided to travel to Yomi, the underworld or land of the dead, to try to retrieve her. As you can imagine, it didn't go as planned. She had already eaten the food of the underworld. She wasn't allowed to come back. And at some point, when she told him not to look back to look at her, he actually did. He saw that she was actually a rotten corpse. And then he was chased by a bunch of hags or ogres that were basically summoned by Izanami. And he ran as fast as he could to try to escape them. They were gaining on him, but he blocked the entrance of the underworld with a giant rock. And so that's why the land of the living and the land of the dead are still separate to this day. So after he had been to the land of the dead, Yomi, he had to purify himself because death is regarded as corrupting or impure in Shinto. And Shinto has a lot of purification ceremonies or misogi that use water, preferably fresh or running water. And after he did this, basically bathing in a river, when he was washing off or drying off, he gave birth to additional gods. So from his eyes came Amaterasu and Tsukiyomi. Amaterasu is the goddess of the moon, and Tsukiyomi is Amaterasu is the goddess of the sun, and Tsukiyomi is the god of the moon, her brother. And then from his nose came Susanoo, the god of storms. And these are three of the most important gods in Shinto today. They're kind of like a heavenly trinity of gods. Susanoo, though, had a fiery temper, and he was often causing problems. You can think of it as the raging of a storm, especially one that comes off the sea. So he was essentially banished from heaven, and he went to say goodbye to his sister Amaterasu. But she wasn't sure what he was there for. She was a little bit leery of him because of his temper, probably. So she came dressed in armor, armed and armored as a warrior, and Susanoo was insulted by this because he hadn't planned on harming her or anything. So he wanted to prove that he was of good intention. And there was a custom in ancient Japan that if you wanted to prove that what you were saying was true, you would basically perform a feat. And if you were successful, if you passed the test you would set for yourself, usually some physical feat, then it would basically verify that what you were saying was true. So they did a contest of who could create more gods, and each one took an item from the other, and they used a comb and a necklace. They used it to create gods, and Susanoo actually created more gods, but Amaterasu said, well, you did it from my jewelry, and so they're actually my gods, so I win, not you. And at this, Susanoo finally got really pissed off. He raged all over heaven and earth. He killed a sacred horse and threw it on a loom, machine for weaving that was being used by one of Amaterasu's servants, killed her servant. It was terrible. So she got really upset from this, and she decided to hide away in a cave. Well, Amaterasu is the goddess of the sun, so the whole world went dark, and all the other kami congregated around the cave trying to coax her out, because without light they couldn't have life and they couldn't see anything. And they were only able to get her out by performing a ruse. They decided to pretend like they were having a party, and they did a loud, raucous dance. And they also said there was a woman even more beautiful than Amaterasu who had arrived outside the cave. So she was intrigued by all this. She opened up the rock that was blocking the cave. They showed her a mirror of herself, and she became jealous of her own reflection. But the story continues, but basically she came out of the cave, light was restored to the world. And this is one of the most famous myths of Shinto. Amaterasu, because she's the ancestor of the emperors of Japan, is often emphasized as the chief kami of heaven. And there's another myth. When Susanoo was banished from heaven, he comes down to earth, and he meets this elderly couple who are crying. There's this evil water dragon that has killed several of their daughters, and they only have one daughter left, and she's basically next. So Susanoo comes up with a brilliant plan. He basically gets the dragon drunk on sake or rice wine, and then is able to kill it with his sword. And then he's able to extract from the tail of the dragon another sword, a magical sword, Kusanagi, which he then gives to Amaterasu, and she basically gives it to the ancestor of the emperors of Japan. The belief is that the emperors of Japan still have the Kusanagi as one of their imperial regalia or sacred objects. So kami can mean a god or a spirit. Or it can mean anything that's sacred and worthy of worship. So most of these things are gods or spirits in the ordinary sense. You can see this, for example, by the fact that kami is equated with the Chinese word shun, S-H-E-N, in Roman alphabet, which is in Japanese is pronounced as Shin, Shin. And that just means a spirit. So kami are basically like the gods or spirits of other religions. However, they can include things like natural objects or places, like mountains or springs. The Mount Fuji itself, Fujisan, is itself regarded as a kami, for example. And they can also include certain legendary or historical persons, such as Ninigi and Jimmu. Ninigi, the ancestor of the emperors of Japan, Jimmu, the first emperor, or even sacred objects such as the aforementioned Kusanagi sword. Sacred objects that are worshipped as kami are usually hidden away in an inner sanctuary and not shown to the public. So here are some examples of kami, apart from the ones we already mentioned. Ebisu, briefly mentioned him, he's the kami of the sea and fishermen. Amaterasu and Tsukiyomi, the kami of the sun and moon, respectively. Susanoo, the kami of storms. Inari is the kami of foxes, but also of rice, fertility, farming, and sake, rice wine, and also tea, and then just wealth and fortune and prosperity. So Inari is a very popular kami, as you might imagine. Inari is also interesting. In addition to being associated with white foxes, Inari can appear either as male or as female or as androgynous. Hachiman is the patron kami of warriors, and Tenjin is the patron kami of scholars or students. So if you have to study for an exam, you might pray to Tenjin, for example. The emperor is also regarded as a kami, including the current emperor of Japan. So the emperors play a role in the Shinto religion because of the belief, in part, that they are descendants of the kami Amaterasu. And this has been the case at least since the Yamato period. So Ninigi was the grandson of Amaterasu, and Jimmu was the great-grandson of Ninigi. So that's the connection between the emperors of Japan, because Jimmu was the first emperor, the first ruler of the Yamato kingdom. And his descendants still rule, at least ceremonially, in Japan today. Ise Shrine is dedicated to Amaterasu and is associated with the imperial family. In 1868, that's when the Meiji Restoration happened, and it's named after the emperor at the time, Emperor Meiji. The rebelling samurai in the West, even though they founded a new government that wasn't really based on the emperor in truth, they regarded themselves as restoring the honor of the emperor and as getting rid of the old military government. And indeed, they did make emperor worship a central part of Shinto. In fact, for part of the period after the Meiji Restoration, it kind of went in phases, but for part of that period, the government promoted Shinto as a way of unifying the nation. And this is called state Shinto by scholars. And they made Shinto officially not a religion precisely because they wanted everyone to participate in Shinto rituals regardless of their other religious commitment. So all Japanese during those periods were supposed to worship the emperor as a kami, and they thought this would help create unity in the nation. That has all changed since 1945. After Japan was defeated by the United States in World War II, the United States imposed a constitution on Japan which separated Shinto from the government, at least officially. The emperor is still a part of the government and is still associated with Shinto, but apart from that, there's no state support for the Shinto religion, although the emperor is still very much esteemed by the Japanese people. And in general, there's kind of a sense that Shinto shrines are important symbols of Japanese culture and nationhood. So a bit more about Shinto shrines, or jinja. Each shrine honors one or more kami, and these could be inspired by natural phenomena, historical events, or particular acts of devotion or patronage that happened in the past. One example of a shrine is Kashima Shrine. This is near the Pacific coast of Honshu, and this particular shrine is often visited by martial artists, such as practitioners of kendo, or the art of fighting with the sword. It has many sub-shrines, so the larger Shinto shrines will have particular sub-shrines where maybe another kami is worshipped, but on the same grounds. So, for example, at Kashima Shrine, one of the sub-shrines celebrates a particular spring of fresh water that flows out of the side of the hill. So you can see how some of the kami are basically spirits of nature. Another sub-shrine at Kashima is a fenced enclosure surrounding a stone. Only the top of the stone is above the surrounding bed of sand. You often see beds of sand around Shinto shrines. And it's supposed to hold in place a giant catfish that causes earthquakes. You can see how Shinto is really connected to a lot of the traditional folklore and mythology of Japan. There is an association of Shinto shrines called Jinja Honcho. Most, but not all, Shinto shrines belong to this, and belonging to it is voluntary. They do meet periodically to decide collective affairs, but essentially, Shinto is not an organized religion, does not have an official theology. There are guidelines promoted by Jinja Honcho, but there's also a lot of variety just from each individual shrine. One thing, though, that's important that the Jinja Honcho does nowadays is it basically provides the criteria for being an officially recognized Shinto priest. So it recognizes which universities have curricula that you can go through, for example, to get the title of Shinto priest. So these are some of the common features within a shrine. The torii is the symbolic gate marking the entrance. You can see another example of one here. There's also two-storied gates like the one on the previous slide that would be further closer to the main buildings of the shrine. Outside the worship hall and main hall of the shrine is going to be a water pavilion. This is a trough of clean water, usually underneath the roof, with ladles, usually made of wood, for worshippers to wash their face and hands. And this is required to purify yourself before praying. And this is an example of how, even though Shinto does not have a official theology or set of things you have to believe, there's no expectation that you have an opinion of what the kami are, for example. But there are very strong expectations about your behavior. So it would be a great insult to the kami to not visit the water pavilion and purify yourself before going to pray. So the Haidan is the larger worship hall, which should be entered by groups or individuals who want to pray to the kami. The Honden is the main hall, which is smaller and not entered. It's the actual place where the kami dwells. So this is the main method of Shinto worship. And as far as we know, this is pretty ancient. It's gone back centuries, if not millennia. There are references, for example, in ancient Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty of people in Japan clapping while praying, and that is still the practice. So you stand outside the worship hall, toss a coin into the offering box, pull on the bell, clap twice, bow in prayer, clap again, and then leave. The bell and the claps are interpreted as to alert the kami to your presence. And then there's a lot of other elements that you would notice at a Shinto shrine. Just a couple of examples. Shimenawa are thick hempen ropes, which are usually placed in front of a worship hall. They can also be placed just in front of a kamidana or Shinto altar. And then you can also see Shimenawa on things like rocks or trees or other things regarded as dwelling places for kami. And then shide are folded white paper strips that are often used to mark sacred objects. You can classify shrines into three main types. Those of local significance would be most Shinto shrines, and these often house the kami of the local area, or the ujigami. And then the second category would be those of kami that are worshipped throughout Japan. Some examples, the Inari shrines, who are dedicated to Inari, the fox kami. The Hachimangu shrines are dedicated to Hachiman, the god of war. The Toshogu shrines are dedicated to Tokugawa Ieyasu, a famous shogun of Japan, the one who established the Tokugawa Bakufu, or military government. And then the Tenmangu shrines honor Tenjin, the kami of scholars, just for example. Those are some of the main ones, though. And then there's shrines of national or semi-political importance. The Ise Grand shrines associated with the emperors, the Izumo shrines, Meiji Shrine honoring Emperor Meiji, associated with the Meiji Restoration. And then Yasukuni Shrine, this is the most controversial Japanese shrine. It commemorates Japan's war dead, but some of the soldiers commemorated there were accused of committing war crimes during World War II. So some other nations, especially in East Asia, like China, for example, that were belligerents or fought with Japan during World War II, they often get upset if a prime minister of Japan goes to visit Yasukuni, for example. Yasukuni is also interesting in that it kind of combines aspects of a Shinto shrine with the Buddhist and Confucian style of ancestor worship in Japan. So, a bit more about Shinto practices. One of the main points in which most Japanese people come into contact with Shinto is just through seasonal festivals like New Year and other festivals. These are called matsuri in Japanese. Another area where a Japanese person might visit a shrine if they're on a pilgrimage. And then if you're just walking past somewhere like a street or a trail through nature, you might walk by a small roadside shrine and just pray to the kami there. So the Shinto is kind of incorporated more into daily life. And that's why a lot of people will practice it, even if they don't regard themselves as religious. A few other Shinto customs, a lot of them involve charms or talismans. Fuda or ofuda are stiff paper strips which bear the name and seal of a shrine. So a lot of people will give a special donation to the priest of the shrine and get an ofuda in return, and then they'll place it on their home altar or kamidana. There's also a custom of using feathered wooden arrows to ward against evil. So a kamidana is a Shinto altar. It can be a shelf or something larger. Oftentimes it'll have an ofuda, an image representing the dwelling place of the kami, shide, shimenawa, offerings to the kami, etc. And then Shinto weddings are still very common in Japan, although they're being replaced by Western style Christian weddings as well. But I think overall Shinto weddings are still pretty common. A little bit about Shinto festivals or matsuri. Just as an example, Gion Festival in July in Kyoto, a lot of the festivals are local to one city. Because they're basically, if they're Shinto festivals, they're associated with a particular shrine where the portable altar of the kami may be taken in a procession through the streets, and it ends with offerings, worship for the kami at their shrine. The Gion Festival or Gion Matsuri is officially dedicated to purification and protection from disease. It's famous among the public for processions of floats on July 17th and July 24th. So some of these festivals last for many days. And people celebrate, it's more of a festive mood. During Shinto festivals, people might be drunk on sake, for example, for part of the time. And at the Gion Matsuri, a lot of people go to street vendors and get skewered roasted meats. So these are some of the festival elements that are often common to Shinto Matsuri. A procession, usually involving a mikoshi or portable shrine. There can also be floats that are decorated with flowers, for example, or have actors performing, acting out parts of plays, usually involving stories of gods or spirits. The portable shrine, which houses the kami, is taken from the main shrine to various points nearby. So it's symbolic of the kami journeying throughout this area. Standards or banners, people drink sake. It's kind of like a big party usually. It may recall a historical event, and the culmination would be some representatives from the community go with the priest to the main shrine to make offerings. But most of the people would participate in the festival not by going to the shrine, but just by, for example, attending or being present or taking part in the processions. Part 3, Japanese Buddhism. Buddhism spread to Japan from Korea in the 6th century AD. This was during the Yamato period, the early period of the Yamato kingdom, which lasts from 4th to 5th century, 4th to the 7th centuries AD. So Prince Shotoku, who is shown in the picture on the slide, was the imperial regent So he ruled in the name of, on behalf of the emperor from 593 to 622 AD. He was the one who actually first established Buddhism as the national religion of Japan. And this was a couple of centuries after it first spread there. It spread in part from some Korean merchants bringing the religion with them. Then there was an official delegation from Korea. And so initially, Buddhism was mainly only popular around the capital, among the nobles, some of the noble families, noble clans, and among the imperial family as well. So from early on, though, Buddhism was linked through the emperor both to the government and Confucian morality, because this was brought over from China around the same time that the emperor started patronizing Buddhism. So after the Yamato period was the Nara period, where the capital was in the city of Nara, and this also became the first center of Buddhism in Japan. The Heian period is named after the move of the capital to Heian-kyo, which is now called Kyoto, and this lasted from 794 to 1185 AD. So some of the main sects of Buddhism in Japan were Tendai, Jodoshu, and Shingon. Tendai is the Japanese version of the Chinese Tiantai Buddhism. And this is the type of Buddhism that's focusing on honoring, basically worshiping the Lotus Sutra, which is a Buddhist scripture that contains the pinnacle, the height of the Buddha's wisdom, according to Tendai. This was actually the first most popular sect of Buddhism in Japan. Also very popular was Jodo-shu, or Pure Land Buddhism, which focuses on worshiping Amitabutsu, or Amitabha Buddha, the Buddha of the Pure Land, who, if you pray to him through the Nembutsu, which is a mantra or chant honoring his name, he will let you be reborn in his Pure Land, hear him teach the Dharma, and from there you'll be able to attain nirvana very swiftly. So the founder of Jodo-shu in Japan was Honen. And then Shingon, this was never as popular as Tendai and Jodo-shu, but it was prominent. It did have many followers. This is the Japanese version of Chanyan, or Vajrayana Buddhism, and its chief temple is on Mount Koya. So it was founded by Kukai, and he's known posthumously as Kobo Daishi. And Shingon, like I said, was never the majority version of Buddhism, but it always did have some dedicated followers. It is the Japanese version of Chanyan, which means true word. That's the Chinese name for mantra. So this is the esoteric Buddhism that puts a lot of focus on secret teachings and special mantras that you can chant. The image on the slide is Chion-in, which is the chief temple of Jodo-shu in Kyoto. And so those imperial capitals like Nara and Kyoto would be very important for Buddhism, because all of the sects of Buddhism would want to build their chief temple there, and plus they would want the support of the emperor and the noble families, who were kind of like the tastemakers of the whole culture. So that's basically why those imperial capitals became centers of the religion as well. Nichiren was a Japanese Buddhist monk who founded his own sect of Buddhism. And he was really obsessed with honoring the Lotus Sutra, like Tendai, but even more so. He taught that you could only be saved, only attain enlightenment by worshiping the Lotus Sutra. And he was very critical of other Buddhist sects in Japan because he thought he was leading the nation into ruin. So his chief mantra that he recommended chanting was Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, which means Hail Wonderful Dharma Lotus Sutra. So there are various forms of Nichiren Buddhism still prominent in Japanese Buddhism today. Japanese Buddhism, like Chinese Buddhism and Mahayana generally, worships many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. As a refresher, Buddhas are enlightened beings who teach the Dharma, or the path to enlightenment, to their entire world or universe. A Bodhisattva is a future Buddha who deliberately puts off their own enlightenment so they can come back at a later time to reintroduce or reteach the Dharma to help save an entire universe of beings. So Bodhisattvas like Kannon, for example, are often regarded as greatly compassionate beings who are very concerned with not only their own salvation but that of others. So one of the most prominent Buddhas in Japanese Buddhism is Jizo, or Jizo-san, who is the Buddha of the underworld or the hell realms. He's the Japanese version of the Chinese Dizang, whose name in Sanskrit is Kshitigarbha. And this is the Buddha who cares for beings that are suffering in the hell realm. So he's compassionate even for people who had bad karma, like maybe they murdered someone or committed some other serious sin. And according to traditional Buddhist thought, a lot of those beings would go to hell in their next life and suffer torments for a long time, just based on their past bad karma. But Jizo is also regarded as a protector of children generally, and specifically infants who died during childbirth or pregnancy. Kannon is the most famous or popular bodhisattva in Japanese Buddhism. It's the Japanese version of the Chinese Guanyin. Her name in Sanskrit is Avalokiteshvara. The original Indian version of Avalokiteshvara was male, but Avalokiteshvara was usually depicted as female in Chinese Buddhism, and that's also true of Japanese Buddhism. The picture is one of the earliest images of Kannon from Todaiji Temple in Nara, and in this case, the Bodhisattva is flanked by the Devas Brahma and Indra, showing that Hindu influence that was kind of retained in Buddhism, even though the gods Brahma and Indra from Hinduism are not the primary object of Buddhist worship. They do appear as, protectors or supporters of the Buddha. And Kannon is especially prominent in Tendai Buddhism. In addition to honoring the Lotus Sutra itself recommends honoring Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, and so that's why Kannon is very popular. And she's also very popular in Soto Zen. Zen being the Japanese version of Chan Buddhism, the Chinese meditation sect. A bit about Buddhist practices in the home. Many Japanese have a Butsudan or Buddhist-style altar, which usually contains a Buddha image, but also spirit tablets which commemorate their ancestors. They may contain Buddhist scriptures and a place for incense. And these are often used to house the mortal remains, the ashes, cremated remains of family members. And so that's why even Japanese people who aren't especially devout Buddhists, they may have these in their home. The picture is of a traditional Butsudan. A common morning ritual performed by Japanese Buddhists is to put a small amount of food on their altar, recite a sutra, light a stick of incense. The exact chants, though, that would be recited are going to vary by the sect of Buddhism. Another aspect of Japanese culture that relates to Buddhism are the Daruma dolls. These are stylized representations of Daruma. Daruma is the Japanese name for Bodhidharma. He was the founder of the Chinese sect of Chan Buddhism. According to traditional Chan or Zen belief, he actually brought that sect to China from India. But he was an Indian monk. He brought this wordless, a special teaching where you use meditation to discover the true nature of your mind and enlightenment directly. He brought that to China, and when Chan Buddhism came to Japan, it was known as Zen, and Zen is one of the most prominent sects of Japanese Buddhism as well. And also, a lot of people will go to Buddhist temples at New Year, not just Shinto shrines. And there are other Buddhist festivals that are popular in general, like the Buddha's birthday, for example. Most Japanese, though, if they have contact with Buddhism, it's going to be at funerals or around rites for the dead. Funerals are still generally Buddhist in Japan. They involve cremating the body. A spirit tablet has their name, and that's the focus for ancestor veneration. There will be a stone memorial at the graveside. And then at the grave, visitors will place thin wooden posts at the tombstone with text written in thick black ink. And there's also a custom of picking out bone fragments for an urn that you place in your Butsudan, your family altar. And those bone fragments are taken from the cremated remains after the cremation itself. And then there's also the spring and autumn equinoxes festivals, or Higan, and these are occasions where family will often visit their departed family members at cemeteries. And Obon is the midsummer festival with bonfires and dancing, but it's also connected to the spirits of the dead. And the Buddhists believe that after death, these beings will seek out a new life, a new incarnation, and people light lanterns to help guide them to their next life. This picture on the slide is showing you the very elaborate Buddhist flower arrangements that are often prepared for traditional Buddhist funerals in Japan. They can be very costly, which is actually one of the reasons why some people are no longer doing Buddhist style funerals. Buddhism has festivals as well. They're also called Matsuri. For example, the Buddha's birthday is on April 8th. The Buddhist calendar was originally lunar, and indeed, for some of the Japanese Buddhist festivals, they follow a lunar calendar, and so the date varies, but some of the dates have also been set by the local or national governments. The Buddha's birthday is one of those, so it always is celebrated on April 8th in Japan, unlike in other Buddhist countries. This is a festival involving flowers. So one of the central practices is having a small statue of the young or infant Buddha placed in a frame, as you can see on the picture, decorated with flowers. And then the statue is anointed with liquid from a bowl beneath. There's also another Buddhist festival, the Festival of the 47 Ronin. Ronin is a masterless samurai or warrior who no longer has a lord. And there's a whole long legend associated with these 47 Ronin. Basically, their lord was forced to commit suicide. This is getting into traditional samurai honor culture, where some samurai or warriors would commit suicide or seppuku, sometimes called harakiri, in order to avoid shame or to try to make up for shame, usually failing their lord. But this was a different situation where their lord was actually pressured into killing himself, and so it was basically a crime against their lord, and they wanted to get revenge. The whole story is told in the Chushingura drama, which is also often reenacted at the time of this particular festival. And so the festival has a procession that reenacts the Ronin's arrival at a temple to report their successfully accomplishing vengeance against the ones who destroyed their lord. And then at this, crowds light incense at their tombs. So you sometimes get these Shinto and Buddhist festivals that kind of commemorate important historical or semi-historical, semi-legendary events from the past. There are also a bunch of aspects of Japanese culture that overlap with religion. One of them was Bushido, the traditional code of the warrior in Japan. And this was also greatly influenced by Confucianism, though. The religious connection could be that the Bushi or warriors, which was basically another name for samurai, they were wanting to sacrifice themselves for their lord. And that kind of connects to Buddhism in a couple ways. One, the idea of not self or no self, so kind of like a no ego view, but also the idea that the worldly existence is temporary and impermanent, and so it's not something you should cling to. No is traditional Japanese drama, but many no plays have Buddhist themes. Chan no Yu, which you can see in the picture, is the tea ceremony. This is actually an art form that involves drinking tea in a ritualized way. And it was perfected by Buddhist monks, including a lot of Zen monks. In this particular picture, you can see in the background a scroll with a stylized painting of Daruma or Bodhidharma, for example. He's often shown with a big mustache and beard and very large eyes. And then other arts like calligraphy, poetry, and painting, they often have religious themes, and a lot of them were perfected in previous centuries by Zen masters or other Buddhists, because a lot of the prominent clergy historically in Buddhism were also from the educated class who would know about literature, would know about art and poetry and all that sort of thing. Part 4, Modern Period. So the word Shin Shugyo is used for new religion. And the process by which new sects are born in Japan is similar to that in which new shrines in Shinto are created. So they can be built based on a religious revelation to a person or a message that was given to a spirit medium. And so there's this idea that the kami or the gods will sometimes reveal themselves or talk to people. They might be Shinto priests or they might not be. Although several of these Shinto sects were actually founded by Shinto clergy. One example of a new religion is Tenrikyo, which means religion of the heavenly wisdom. It was founded by Nakayama Miki, who lived in the 19th century. She had revelations and healings. She and her followers founded a sacred city called Tenri, and this sect has its own scriptures and rituals. So this would be an example of a new religion that's sort of coming out of a Shinto tradition or Shinto influence perspective. Another example is Tensho Kotai Jingukyo, or Odoru Shugyo, which means the dancing religion. This was founded by Kitamura Sayo, who believed a kami was speaking through her abdomen. So a lot of these do start with particular messages or revelations from kami. So kagura, or sacred dances, are a big part of Shinto generally. Rituals at the shrines often involve kagura, whether performed by the priest or by shrine maidens. But in this particular sect, Odoru Shugyo, they have an ecstatic dance, which you can see in the picture, that is supposed to enable you to achieve this spiritual mystical state of muga, or not self. So you can see this is a syncretic religion sense. It's taking the idea of kami from Shinto and the idea of not self from Buddhism, and also creating something new from it. There have also been some new sects and movements of Buddhism started in the last couple centuries. One of them is Risho Koseikai, which is a movement led by lay people. So some of the modern movements have that. They were founded by Buddhist lay people rather than by monks. And this particular one was founded in 1938. It was branching off from an earlier movement called Ryukai, but it focuses on the Lotus Sutra and ancestor worship. And another new Buddhist organization is Soka Gakkai, also led by lay people, founded in 1930. It takes the Buddhist idea of nonviolence pretty literally or strictly. So some of the founders even opposed a Japanese war effort in the 1930s and 40s, which was very politically controversial at the time. I think some of them were imprisoned for a while. And then after the war, they started to proliferate more, get more followers. Unlike most sects of Japanese Buddhism, they actively seek out foreign converts. And so there's actually international branches of Soka Gakkai. They are affiliated with Nichiren Shoshu, which is an order of monks in the Nichiren tradition. That's kind of like their monastic or clerical parallel, but the organization itself is still controlled by lay people. And they even have a political party they're affiliated with, Komeito, the Clean Government Party. You sometimes see Shinto sects associated with political parties. Some of them are right-wing nationalist parties because of the connection between Shinto, the emperor, and Japanese national identity. In terms of the present and future of Japanese religion, on the one hand, Japan has largely secularized. Like most other industrialized nations, religious affiliation, religious participation have fallen greatly. Confucianism does still retain an influence on the culture, at least indirectly, through values such as loyalty, shame, correct behavior, deferring to elders, etc. And then there is still the fact mentioned earlier that a lot of Japanese people who don't regard themselves as religious, they still might participate in Shinto and Buddhist ceremonies or practices, festivals at shrines, during funerals, weddings, and so on. And then finally, another surviving aspect of Shinto and Buddhism in the culture is in popular culture, such as in film, anime, manga, or comics, video games, etc., often make reference to Shinto and Buddhist beliefs or entities. Okay, that's about it for Korean and Japanese religions. Next up, if you're taking my class, we're going to skip ahead to chapters 30 to 35 for Judaism. If you're following just the order in the textbook, it is going to be chapters 25 to 29, Jainism. Either way, until then.